controversial protest.
It's a provocation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today.
Today is a truly historic day. Sweden is now member of NATO.
Swedish-Turkish relations have been in the news for all the wrong reasons recently. But in 2018, the Swedish government made headlines by tweeting that Swedish meatballs are in fact not Swedish, but Turkish. Turks were delighted, Swedish chefs were angry, most people were confused, and historians were annoyed that so much attention had centered on the least interesting outcome of the Great Northern War, the most important turning point in history that you probably haven't heard of, where the biggest and weirdest personalities of the 1700s faced off in a ferocious 21-year war that forged much of the world we know today, including the current conflict in Ukraine, the ongoing drama in Swedish-Turkish relations, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But our story gets weirder than that. Did you know that there is a brand of Swedish beer named after a celebrated Ottoman battleship? Or that words like kalabalik and dolma have been commonly used in Swedish for centuries? Or that for 5 years the Swedish Empire was ruled from an Ottoman castle in Moldova built by Mimar Sinan? Or that an alliance of Turks, Swedes and Ukrainians once very nearly wiped Russia off the map? The fact that it failed led to the eventual collapse of the Swedish and Ottoman empires and the end of Ukrainian hopes for sovereignty. In their place, the imperial rise of the Principality of Muscovy, thereafter better known as Russia. In the late 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power and sophistication, known today as the Tulip era, straddling 3 continents and wielding the world's 3rd biggest military. Ahmet III, the Tulip Emperor, was the greatest patron of the arts of his age and himself an avid composer, poet, philosopher and philanthropist. He had no interest in war, which he saw as a failure of governance, much unlike his warrior father, Mehmed IV, whose reign had seen the empire reach the height of its territorial expansion. He was a nice guy, but probably not the right man to face down the growing threat from Russia. His decisions in the coming war would spell the end of his dynasty. From 1682, Muscovy was ruled by Peter I, who by the end of our story will become Peter the Great. But Turks would remember him by a different name, Deli Petro, or Peter the Mad. And with good reason. His alcoholism, cruelty, and 7-foot stature made him infamous across Europe. Other than torturing his own children to death and personally impaling his enemies, his main interest was shipbuilding. Peter dreamt of creating a modern European naval power by gaining access to the Black Sea from the Ottoman Empire and the Baltic Sea from the Swedish Empire. In line with this plan, Peter attacked the Ottomans' Tatar vassals in Crimea in 1695 and captured Azov, gaining control of the Don River and access to the Black Sea, before turning his attention westwards. At the time, Sweden was one of the world's poorest, most sparsely populated countries, with its entire economy and society arranged around warfare to defend the long borders it ended up with after declaring independence from Denmark in 1523. This made it the most militarized country in the world and kind of the North Korea of 17th century Europe. The Swedish army was trained to use speed and technology to outmaneuver and defeat much larger foes. The instruction to hold fire until you see the white of their eyes first appeared in 17th century Swedish military manuals as a way of saving ammunition, thus reducing the weight that each soldier was expected to carry. These tactics proved their worth in the 30 Years' War, winning the Swedish Empire territory in Poland, Germany, and even North America, as well as many enemies. In 1697, 10% of Sweden's population was wiped out by famine, and that same year, Emperor Charles XI died, leaving his 14-year-old son on the throne. Peter seized the opportunity and forged an alliance with Norway-Denmark and Poland-Saxony-Lithuania to attack Sweden from all sides, divide its territories, and finally win Russia access to the Baltic Sea. With the alliance's combined population 40 times larger than that of Sweden, everyone thought the war would be over in a matter of months. But the new king was no ordinary teenager. Karl, or Charles XII, was an obsessive, fearless, possibly autistic child genius who never married, never drank, never showed emotion, and was only ever interested in one thing: war. From a young age, Charles had insisted on always wearing a soldier's uniform and having military rations brought to the palace for his every meal. He spent his free time training with his father's soldiers and was already skilled in almost every aspect of combat. He was also the first European monarch of the age who refused to wear a wig or speak French at court. He would spend his entire adult life on the front line and become the last European monarch to die in battle. His biographer, Voltaire, called him the most extraordinary man who ever lived. His battlefield tactics and risk-taking methodologies have been studied by everyone from Napoleon to Elon Musk, while Swedish playwright August Strindberg called him the ruin of Sweden and the fool's idol. Contemporary Europeans knew him as the Lion of the North, but Turks would remember him as Demirbaş, which in Europe has been directly translated as Iron Head, but in Turkish has a very different meaning, as we will see. In Sweden, he has recently become a symbol of the Swedish far right, despite pioneering Sweden's progressive taxation system and legalizing the practice of Islam in Sweden for the first time. Charles made an oath on his father's deathbed to protect the realm at all costs. When all Sweden's neighbors declared war on him at once, the new emperor was delighted. What happened next has been studied by generals and historians ever since. Over the next 8 years of non-stop fighting, the tiny Swedish army defeated most of Northern Europe without losing a single major battle. Denmark was forced into a humiliating surrender, Norway was annexed, and Poland's king was replaced with a Swedish puppet. Europe watched as Sweden squared up against the end-of-level boss, Russia. At the Battle of Narva, Charles led an amphibious assault on the Baltic coast with 10,000 Swedes against 40,000 fortified Russians. The battle lasted one afternoon with over 10,000 Russian casualties to Sweden's 667 and the capture of 10 Russian generals. The same thing happened over and over again as the Swedes pushed into Russian territory, with the Russians outnumbering the Swedes by an average of 5-1 each time. As William Bolito put it in his book 12 Against the Gods, a historical analysis of the art of risk-taking, Charles made war into what schoolboys dreamed it ought to be. When Elon Musk announced that it was his favorite book in 2016, the few remaining original copies were selling on Amazon for $575. By 1708, the Swedish army was the most experienced fighting force in the world, and Charles XII, now a strapping 25-year-old, was having the time of his life. Having fought on the front line of every battle and survived numerous injuries, he now considered himself to be invincible and on a mission from God to kill Peter, which led to some pretty brazen risk-taking. At the Battle of Grodno, Charles personally set off with 800 soldiers to defeat a Russian army of 9,000. When Peter offered peace, Charles's reply was, "I vow never to start an unjust war, but never to end a just one without the complete ruin of my enemies." It was with this mindset that Charles would become the first of many European dictators to make the mistake of invading Russia in winter, braving scorched earth tactics, stretched supply lines, and the coldest winter in European history. Around this time, the Swedes were offered an alliance by the Ukrainian Cossacks, who were famously ferocious in battle and had long dreamt of independence from Russian influence. Ivan Mazepa was an exiled Polish prince who had risen to become one of their leaders. With the Swedish advance, he saw an opportunity to rise up against the Tsar in what was arguably the greatest Ukrainian uprising until 2014. But by the time he met up with the Swedish army, Mazepa's revolution had already failed. Most of the Cossack clans stayed loyal to Russia, while Peter burned Mazepa's capital of Baturin and crucified its inhabitants. Nonetheless, Mazepa reached the Swedish camp with up to 10,000 Cossack cavalry. Against the advice of his officers, Charles ignored the Russian assault on his own border and marched his undefeated 20,000 men, half his original army, and his new Ukrainian allies towards Moscow. Moscow, intending to kill Peter in his own home. In April 1709, they laid siege to a Russian fort in the city of Poltava, their last stop before moving on Moscow. On the morning of his 27th birthday, while helping to dig the trenches outside the city walls, Charles was hit in the foot by a long shot from the fort. True to his style, he didn't even mention it to his men. When they noticed their king was turning pale that evening, the doctor cut off his boot and found that the bullet had entered his heel, passed through his whole foot, and lodged itself in his big toe. Despite Charles's protestations, the Swedish army would have to go to battle without their invincible king for the first time. At the Battle of Poltava, the Russians finally broke the Swedes' winning streak as they tried to scale the last of their 4 defensive batteries. 14,000 Swedes were captured and worked to death building St. Petersburg on the newly occupied Baltic coast, while most of the Cossacks were executed on the spot as traitors. The Battle of Poltava was instantly recognized as a turning point in history, inspiring everything from Japanese miniature paintings to seminal works by Russian artists like Pushkin and Tchaikovsky. The 10th of July became a Russian national holiday. But all was not lost. Charles, Mazepa, and a few thousand soldiers fled south to the Dnieper River and the border of the Ottoman province of Moldova, where they were welcomed as heroes by Sultan Ahmet III. They would stay as guests of the Ottomans for 5 years, during which they learnt Turkish and fell in love with Turkish food. The Ottomans joined Sweden's war against Russia, and Peter himself was taken prisoner by the Janissaries. Then things got even more weird. Watch the second part of our series, which charts the dramatic rise and fall of the Swedish-Ottoman alliance.